Hello, my name is Daniel. Thank you for being here with me today. If you enjoy real, heartbreaking cheating stories from Reddit, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. It really means a lot to me. This is one of those stories that feels heavy from the very start, like a cloud hanging over everything, a reminder of how easily love can twist into something fragile and painful. The story begins with a young woman named Hannah, 25 years old, who moved to a quiet gray city in upstate New York less than a year ago to start graduate school. She had left behind familiar streets and faces, trying to build a new life from scratch. That's where she met Ethan, a 27-year-old man who, at first, seemed like her anchor in an unfamiliar place. They had been dating for 6 months now, and Hannah thought she was finally settling into something safe, something steady. Not long ago, Ethan told her he loved her for the first time. For a moment, she felt warmth and hope, as though all the loneliness of moving had been worth it. But that warmth chilled when he admitted she was the first person he had ever said those words to. Hannah was surprised, though not in a bad way. She didn't make it into a big deal. She thought it was sweet, vulnerable even. But then he asked a question that left her unsettled. He wanted to know how many other men she had said, "I love you" to. She told him the truth. 1. That honesty seemed to carve a line between them. Ethan already knew that Hannah still exchanged the occasional text with her ex, Caleb, but it had never been a problem before. At least, she thought it hadn't. After that conversation, Ethan's questions became sharper, more specific. He asked if Caleb was the man she had once said, "I love you" to. Hannah stayed honest and said yes. Caleb and Hannah had known each other since they were 15, 2 kids who had grown up side by side. They dated through their late teens and into their early 20s. But when Hannah got accepted into graduate school across the country, they both knew things had to end. Their breakup wasn't filled with screaming or betrayal. It was quiet, even kind. They acknowledged they had become different people and chose to let go before they started resenting each other. They stayed friends in the aftermath. When Hannah still lived in town, they would talk about once a week. Now, across the miles, it's mostly just quick, shallow texts. 10 a week, at most. "How's work? Hope you're doing okay." Simple words. Nothing more. But when Ethan heard that Caleb was the man she had once said, "I love you" to, something inside him shifted. He began pressing her, again and again, asking, "Do you still love him?" Hannah tried to answer carefully. She told Ethan she didn't love Caleb romantically anymore. He had been a huge part of her life for so long, and yes, she still carried positive feelings toward him. She thought of him almost like family now, an important person in her past who had shaped her. But that answer wasn't enough. Ethan kept digging, as though trying to find a confession buried somewhere inside her. Eventually, under all that pressure, Hannah admitted that she would probably always love Caleb as a person, that she would always respect him, even though there was no romantic connection left and no part of her that wanted him back. Ethan didn't take that well. The next day, he told her something that felt like a punch she couldn't quite see coming. He said he didn't believe she could truly love him, not completely, unless she unloved every man from her past. Hannah felt her chest tighten as those words sunk in. She tried to explain, gently but firmly, that love for someone as a friend was not the same as being in love with someone. That her heart wasn't holding on to Caleb in the way Ethan thought. She told him that he was the only man she had romantic feelings for. But Ethan wouldn't let it go. He insisted that she needed to erase those feelings, to change something deep and human inside her. He seemed almost angry that she wasn't bitter toward Caleb, that she didn't spit his name out with resentment. Hannah began to feel like she was losing her grip on what was reasonable, like she was taking crazy pills, as she later described it. She couldn't understand why she was being asked to cut out a part of her past, to pretend that 7 years of her life never happened. She wondered if she was overreacting, if she was somehow in the wrong. But deep down, a hollow sadness was forming, the kind that comes when you realize someone you care about might not accept the parts of you that existed before them. Hannah had tried to be clear, even though she felt like she was drowning in doubt. People online kept pointing out that 10 texts a week with Caleb wasn't much, especially compared to the 50 or more she and Ethan sent each other every day. To her, those little check-ins with Caleb were almost meaningless, just tiny fragments of shared history that hadn't yet faded away. But strangers on the internet also saw things she hadn't wanted to face. They said Ethan's behavior was a red flag, that the way he pressed her, the way he insisted she unlove someone from her past, wasn't just insecurity, it was control. Some told her to tread carefully. Others said to run. A month later, Hannah posted an update. She said there wasn't a happy ending, though she sounded strangely calm as she typed those words. She had spent days thinking about the comments, replaying them in her mind as she lay awake at night in her small rented room in upstate New York. The consensus was clear. Her communication with Caleb was innocent enough, but Ethan's demands were not okay. She couldn't ignore that anymore. So Hannah decided to talk to Ethan. She wanted to be fair, even kind, because she still believed that maybe there was something worth saving. She told him she understood he was uncomfortable with her staying in touch with Caleb. She even offered to cut down the contact, to limit the already shallow texts even further. Ethan seemed pleased when she said that. For a brief moment there was quiet between them, like maybe they could move forward. But Hannah had more to say. She told him that while she was willing to compromise, she couldn't ignore how he had handled everything, the demands, the pressure, the way he'd made her feel like she was going crazy. She said she needed them to handle conflicts differently, that she needed respect, not commands. Her voice stayed soft the whole time. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't accusing, she was drawing a line, hoping he would understand. But Ethan didn't listen. He snapped. The calm broke like glass under a hammer. He started screaming, his words spilling out in sharp, ugly bursts. Hannah tried to leave, her heart pounding as she stepped toward the door. Then the kitchen turned violent. Dishes crashed against the wall, a glass shattered at her feet. A ceramic bowl skidded across the counter and fell, breaking into pieces. Before she could react, Ethan grabbed her. His hands were rough and unyielding, and in one horrifying second, he slammed her head against the wooden doorframe. The pain was immediate, white-hot and shocking. Hannah stumbled, the room spinning. Her lips split open, and the taste of blood filled her mouth. One of her eyes was already swelling, darkening into what would become a deep, ugly bruise. She didn't know how long the chaos lasted. It was broken by the sound of pounding footsteps and a voice from the hallway. A neighbor had heard the screaming. Someone called the police. Ethan was arrested. Hannah was taken to the hospital, her face throbbing and her body trembling from shock. Later, she would write that she was grateful this had happened now, just 6 months in, rather than years down the road, when leaving might have been harder, when the damage might have been worse. She pressed charges. She filed for a restraining order. It was a horrible, messy ending, but at least it was an ending. In her update, Hannah thanked the strangers who had spoken up when she couldn't see the warning signs for herself. She said she wasn't crazy for feeling like something was wrong. She wasn't overreacting. Her words were steady, but between the lines you could feel the weight of it all, the way betrayal cuts deepest when it's wrapped in love, the way trust can turn dangerous when you ignore the cracks too long. And though she tried to sound brave, there was still a quiet sadness in her final note, the kind that lingers even when the bruises begin to heal. For now, Hannah stayed somewhere safe, in a classmate's spare room tucked away in a quiet neighborhood of upstate New York where Ethan didn't know the address. She admitted she felt lucky for that, and for the neighbor who called the police when she couldn't. When she wrote about it online, her words carried a shaky relief, but also a heavy sadness. She reflected on how strange it felt that things had spiraled so far, so fast. She had once believed that Ethan's demand for her to unlove someone from her past was just an odd, almost laughable insecurity. But now the words haunted her. How do you unlove someone? How do you erase the human instinct to feel kindness toward people who helped shape who you are? There was no answer that made sense. And yet, that strange insistence, that demand to rewrite her own heart, had been the first sign of the storm that followed. Hannah managed to escape before the damage was worse, but her bruises and the way she flinched at sudden sounds told their own story. After her post about Ethan ended, the thread shifted abruptly, like the internet does, from one heartbreak to another. The next story came from someone else, a different kind of pain, but still familiar in its quiet desperation. A 34-year-old woman wrote about her situation, and her voice trembled through the words. She explained that she lived in shared company housing with a woman 4 years younger than her, someone she'd once considered a friend. That friend had brought a dog into the apartment, even though the lease forbade it. At first, she didn't say anything. She wanted to keep the peace. But silence has a cost. She had asthma and severe allergies, and the dog made things worse, much worse. Within months, she was on steroids just to manage her breathing. The doctor told her bluntly, if something didn't change, she could end up in real danger. The landlord had already told the roommate she needed to move out by March 30th, but she showed no signs of actually leaving. She ignored every rule as though they didn't apply to her. And she'd just been fired from the job that had secured the housing in the first place. The woman admitted she was dreading the confrontation, almost to the point of sickness. Her family lived far away. She had nowhere else to go. She asked for advice, and the internet didn't hold back. One reply cut through with brutal clarity. Stop being a doormat. Stop being polite to people who are literally making you sick. The words stung, but they worked. In her update, she said she had finally found her voice. Her roommate's behavior had only gotten worse, leaving trash in recycling bins, taking other people's food, even refusing to bathe the dog, almost as if she wanted to make things unbearable. So the woman went to the company heads, this time armed with doctor's notes and all the courage she could scrape together. She told them plainly, if they didn't step in, she'd have no choice but to resign and leave. Something shifted after that. The company finally acted. A new contract was signed, forcing the roommate to leave earlier, January 25th. Her work phone and computer were taken back. She was banned from returning to the property after that date. And in an unexpected show of support, the company promised to reimburse her for the medical bills she'd piled up because of the allergies. She ended her post saying she thought it was the best outcome she could have hoped for, but there was a quiet ache underneath, the kind that comes from realizing how much she'd suffered before she fought back, and how close she had come to breaking. Realistically, the woman from the previous story was right. She had reached the best outcome she could, but there was a shadow behind her words, an echo of how close she came to breaking before she found her voice. Relief often carries the weight of all the suffering that came before it.
The thread moved on, as these stories always do, but the next one carried a quieter, more tender kind of sadness. It came from a man in his early 40s named Richard, who admitted he wasn't used to writing online. He apologized for his clumsy formatting, saying the internet wasn't exactly his comfort zone. Richard wrote about his son James, who had just turned 20. From the very first lines, it was clear how much he adored that boy. He said there was nothing James could ever do that would make him love him less. But the love was complicated by guilt. Richard confessed that for the first half of James's life, he wasn't really there. He and his son's mother had split when James was still a baby, and Richard was lost in his own battles, numbing himself with heroin and unfit for the role of fatherhood. For years, he only saw James 2 or 3 times a year. He skipped over some of the darker details, calling them his son's private story to tell, but he revealed the turning point. When James was 12, he told Richard the truth, that life with his mother and her boyfriend was filled with mistreatment, that he was hurting in ways a child should never hurt. Something inside Richard broke. He got clean, he fought for custody, and against every mistake he had made, he won. From that moment on, he was a single, sober father. James cut almost all contact with his mother, and Richard poured himself into being the parent he should have been all along.
In his post, Richard's pride bled through every line. He described James as fiercely loyal, endlessly kind, and somehow still positive, despite all the pain he'd endured. He wrote, "I don't know how I got so lucky to be his dad. Watching him grow from that sweet boy into the man he is today brings me to tears." When James was 18, he got accepted into one of the top universities across the country. Richard admitted it was bittersweet. His heart ached to see him go, but he was overjoyed that his son's dreams were unfolding. James visited home every other month, and on the months he didn't, Richard made the trip to see him. James was thriving, making friends, doing well in school, smiling in every photo he sent. By his second year, James was living off campus with his closest friend, a quiet young man named Daniel. Richard had long suspected that his son might be gay, even from his teenage years. He wrote that not with judgment, but with a soft acceptance, almost a relief that his suspicion was finally confirmed. Now it was clear. Daniel wasn't just James's roommate, he was his boyfriend. When the pandemic hit, James decided to come home and quarantine with his father rather than stay in his off-campus apartment. But there was a complication. If James left, Daniel would be alone. Daniel's family lived in Canada, and from what James had shared, things weren't good there. So James asked, nervously, if Daniel could come too. Richard didn't hesitate. "Of course," he wrote back. For 6 weeks, the house was alive again, but it was also layered with quiet moments of tension and tenderness. James and Daniel thought they were being discreet, but Richard noticed the little things. The way Daniel would slip and call James babe or sweetie at breakfast. The way James's arm would drape around him during movie nights when the lights were off. Richard pretended not to see, for their sake. One morning, though, the pretense broke. Richard woke before dawn for his usual run. Something nudged him, maybe instinct, maybe curiosity, and he pushed open James's door, just a crack. There they were, James and Daniel, curled up together in the same bed, asleep in each other's arms. Richard closed the door softly, as if the sound of it latching would disturb the fragile peace in that room, and stepped out into the early morning air. For his run, but with each step the sight of them stayed with him. For the rest of the day, he wrestled with one thought. How do I tell my son that he doesn't have to hide? When Richard shared this online, his words felt heavy, almost hesitant. He didn't want James and Daniel to feel like they had to sneak around in his own house, like they were doing something wrong. He didn't want to force them to come out before they were ready. That wasn't his place. But he hated the idea that his home, of all places, might feel like a closet. The comments poured in. One person wrote, "You're an amazing dad. You cleaned up your life to be there for your son, and that means more than anything. He knows that. I promise he knows that." Another shared her own story. "I'm a lesbian. I can tell you, your son is probably just afraid to say it out loud. The best thing you can do is show him it's safe. Maybe just call Daniel his boyfriend, casually, like it's nothing. Or write him a note, something simple but real." A third wrote about her own father, how he once called her unprompted to say he loved her no matter what. She wasn't gay, but that phone call had stayed with her. "Even if I had been, I would have been terrified to tell him," she admitted. "That's why what you're doing matters so much." Richard read every comment. He didn't reply to all, but he took their advice to heart. A few days later, he came back with an update. He started by thanking everyone, sincerely, almost overwhelmingly. He hadn't expected so many people to read his post. He thought maybe 100 people at most would see it, but instead there were thousands offering love and kindness to a stranger. Then he described what happened. James was busy that day, juggling assignments for both his university classes and a freelancing job. Richard didn't want to interrupt him, so he waited. That night after dinner, Daniel excused himself to take a bath. The house fell quiet. Richard sat on the couch next to his son. The TV flickered, but neither of them were really watching. He turned to James. "Son, I love you. You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, but I want you and Daniel to feel comfortable being yourselves in my house. You never need to hide anything from me. Not here." The words hung in the air for a moment, trembling but certain. James blinked, then broke into an almost relieved laugh. "Oh, thank God," he said, shaking his head. "I thought you knew, but didn't say anything because you didn't want to make it weird." Richard smiled, though his throat felt tight. For months they had been tiptoeing around the truth, each afraid to make the other uncomfortable. Now at last, the silence broke. James told him that yes, he and Daniel had been together since their first year of university. That's why they'd moved in together their second year. And Richard, for the first time in years, felt his home expand with something warm. Not just acceptance, but belonging. When Richard finally sat down with James and Daniel, the conversation stretched longer than he expected. There were things his son told him that night that stung. Not because they were painful to hear, but because they made him realize how much he had missed when James was younger. James laughed as he confessed that Richard wasn't quite the intuitive parent he thought he was. Apparently, back in secondary school, one of James's closest friends had been his boyfriend for almost a year, and Richard had been completely oblivious. He admitted this with a wry smile, but there was something bittersweet about it too. A reminder of how distant Richard had been during those early years and how many important moments he'd lost to his own mistakes. After Daniel came back from his bath, they all sat in the living room, the weight of unspoken words finally lifting. They talked, hesitantly at first, then with more ease. James confirmed what Richard already knew, that he and Daniel had been together since their first year of university. Then came the harder truth. Daniel, quiet for much of the evening, finally shared why his own family wasn't in his life anymore. A few years ago, he had come out to his parents, and in response, they had turned away from him. They didn't just reject his words, they rejected him. Richard wrote later that hearing this nearly broke him. He couldn't understand how anyone could turn their back on their child for something as simple as loving someone. He told Daniel, right there in that dimly lit living room, that he was part of their family now, that he belonged, whether his parents claimed him or not. It wasn't a grand declaration, just a few quiet words, but Daniel's shoulders seemed to ease, as if some of the weight he had carried for years had shifted, just slightly. Richard's post wasn't written like a story with a big twist or dramatic ending. He even apologized for it not being groundbreaking, the way some readers might expect. But he said something important. He was relieved that his son no longer felt like he had to hide, that James could simply exist in his own home, fully himself, without secrecy or shame. The sadness in his words was subtle, but there. It lived in the lines about his own past, about the years he wasn't there, about the things he couldn't undo. But there was also hope. In the space between his sentences, you could feel it, a family finding its shape again. The thread shifted again, as stories online so often do, into something messier, rawer. This time it was from an 18-year-old named Liam, and the pain in his words was almost physical to read. Liam had just discovered messages on his 19-year-old girlfriend's phone. They weren't the kind of messages you could misunderstand. Texts to her friend about her ex, full of crude details, even laughing about how sore she was afterward. He wrote that he felt sick, like his chest had been ripped open. Her ex was someone he had always felt inferior to, a shadow he thought he couldn't escape. Now that shadow had teeth. He said he was distraught, and the word felt too small for what he described. Liam had no one to turn to. His two closest friends had cut him off over a trivial argument just weeks earlier. He had just moved into university housing, still a stranger in his own dorm. His family barely spoke to him, and when they did, the conversations were clipped, cold. So when his girlfriend's betrayal landed, it didn't just hurt, it dismantled him. He saw her cry, hitting the steering wheel, muttering apologies she didn't even know he could hear. He told her they were over, but even in writing those words, he admitted something harder, that part of him didn't know how to let go. He wrote that he felt hollow, that his coping skills were practically nil. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat. He couldn't stop replaying those texts in his mind, imagining what they described until the images carved deeper into him. By 4 a.m, he was still awake, staring at the ceiling, asking strangers on the internet how to move from this to anything resembling okay. The support came like a wave, hundreds of comments, thousands of small kindnesses. When he updated the next day, there was a flicker of something lighter. He wrote that he finally fell asleep at 7 a.m., woke up to find hundreds of messages telling him to be strong, and somehow that mattered. Not everyone sucks, he wrote. But beneath the gratitude, the sadness remained, raw, unfinished, like a wound that hadn't even begun to scar. Liam's last update felt quieter, though the sadness still lingered between his words. He wrote that a few small things had gone right. His part-time tutoring job praised him for his work, a long-delayed package finally arrived, and even one of the friends who had cut him off reached out with an apology. They were small victories, but they mattered in ways he hadn't expected. He said he felt lighter, like maybe the worst part of the storm had passed, but he didn't pretend the ache was gone. "I'm doing better," he wrote, "but some days I still feel the weight of it." Then, almost as an afterthought, he admitted something that had been sitting on his tongue for days. "I did it. I didn't go back to her." He thanked everyone who had urged him to stay strong, who had pushed him to hold that line when his heart wanted to give in. He said their words had been the difference between collapsing and standing, between getting pulled back into her lies and finally walking away. It wasn't a triumphant ending. It wasn't even clean, but it was the kind of ending that felt real. A boy bruised by betrayal, still stumbling, but finding enough hope to keep moving forward. What Liam's story reminds us is that heartbreak rarely ends neatly. Healing isn't linear. It's slow, uneven, and often lonely. If you're caught in the wreckage of a toxic relationship, Start with boundaries. Write them down. Say them out loud. Tell someone you trust. Even the smallest line can save you from slipping back into what hurt you. Seek support from friends, family, even strangers online. Sometimes the voices that remind you to stand tall are the ones you least expect. And above all, trust your own worth. You don't have to unlove someone overnight, but you can choose not to let that love destroy you.